Initial Thoughts is a spoiler-free movie review series. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome back to Initial Thoughts, a series in which we talk about films as and when they are released. Today's film we're talking about is a big one, Dune Part 2, which is directed by Denis Villeneuve and has an all-star cast led by Timothée Chalamet, Zendaya and Rebecca Ferguson. So back in 2021, when I started talking about movies properly for the first time, one of the biggest movies that year, and actually my favourite movie of 2021, was Dune. A movie that I knew very little about going into. I hadn't read the book. I hadn't much of a context of the story. I know it's obviously a historical story from, I believe, the 60s. It's a long, long way back, and certainly way before things like Star Wars. It was one of the core potential adaptations. But I know they had that movie, David Lynch's version, back in, was it the 70s, the 80s? It was a long time ago, and it really didn't connect. It really didn't hit the mark. I haven't seen it, and I don't think I'm going to bother seeing it. I've seen some clips, and just not really for me. It actually seems a little bit akin to the original animated Lord of the Rings film compared to Peter Jackson's trilogy, and that seems to be quite an apt comparison because it didn't really capture anything of what those films were able to do. So skipping ahead to Dune and my feelings on it, I went into the first film with optimism. I thought the film had certainly the potential to be special, certainly a film that breaks the mold of what we've got into nowadays, which is cinema being very superhero heavy, and not that, and I know it's in a bit of a lull at the moment, but that has been a real strive, and especially around 2021, we also had another great movie that year, which was Spider-Man No Way Home, and that was the one that really raked in a lot at the box office. But for me, Dune really stood out for that year. And actually, since that movie ended, Dune Part 2 has been top of my list of anticipated movies basically since. I have very much been counting down the days until this movie has been released, because the more I've seen the first Dune, the more it made me want to actually go and read the book. And I thought, will I do that, or will I just hold off and really experience the story for a first-time viewer when the movies are released? So I didn't read the book. I'm not really a book guy, I've said that before, and I waited. And now we have Dune Part 2. The movie that was supposed to release last year but got pushed back due to the strikes and everything like that. And a movie that, when it got pushed back, I was very disappointed because I built up so much hope and so much excitement for it. Not that I was feeling that I was going to get let down in any way. I just knew it was pushed back because of marketing and everything like that, which was fine. And I understood that. I was just annoyed as a fan that I had waited so long and then I had to wait again. So the anticipation built even more for Dune Part 2. And then, cut to now. We finally get to see it. And if you've heard from anybody, I didn't get an early screener for this. I'm not at that liberty. I very much go when the movies are released in my local cinema. 1st of March, I was there. And going into it, I had heard so many good things. And usually, you know, if you go into a movie with anticipation and then you hear people saying it's good, well, that obviously builds on it, and it maybe adds to your anticipation, maybe it adds to your expectation as well, and a little bit like that. But the sheer amount of positive and really people waxing lyrical about this movie on a level that I haven't heard maybe since I've started doing this channel and started chatting about movies all those years back in 2021. This is probably the most widely received movie, or so well received movie by both audiences and critics since I've started talking about this. So whenever I'm seeing people giving it 9s and 10s out of 10, the critics giving it 9s and 10 out of 10, the audience doing the same, I'm thinking to myself, this could be really, really special. Like, really special. Not just one that personally I, and like a lot of people, really loved the first film. I know it didn't connect with everybody, and I know people weren't totally enamored with the first film. They didn't love it, but I really did. I really loved that first film. And actually, if you remember, I gave it a 9.5 out of 10. And the reason was, and I actually thought about it after, you know, why didn't I give it 10? What was the thing that was hampering it? And actually, it was the ending. And I don't mean that the ending was bad. It was just simply that the film ended. It was like, you've just given me so much feeling and so much of an experience in the first film. and I need more, and you've just said, right, we'll stop there, I'll see you again in 3 years. And that was how it felt. But as soon as Dune Part 2 started, from the opening scene, the first 10 minutes, I was like, oh yeah, this is what I've wanted and more. And I'm going to be honest, guy, usually whenever I talk about movies, I kind of draw it out. Did I like it? What's the pros? What's the cons? I'll maybe leave you in suspense. Dune Part 2 is quite simply the best cinematic experience I've had since doing this channel. And actually, the best cinematic experience I've had in maybe between 5 to 10 years. Truly something special. This movie is not just a movie, it's an experience. And I've only described a few films like that, but this really is that. And I don't mean sitting with an audience and building expectation and, oh my god, who's going to show up in an Infinity War Endgame kind of way. And not to downplay them, they are good in their own right, but this is something completely different. This is cinema. And that sounds so silly and so cliche, but I can't think of any other way to describe it. Because what Denis Villeneuve has been able to achieve in so many of his outings as a director and just what he brings to the screen in very different films. A Blade Runner 2049 compared to A Prisoners. A Sicario compared to Arrival. Very, very different films, but all have this kind of base through line that always has that connective point. And don't get me wrong, all of those films don't they connect on very different levels, but it's hard to find anybody that didn't like them. You know what I mean? Like Arrival, for example, it's probably the one of his that I've connected with least, but a lot of people will say is one of his best. And that's just personal preference, maybe just personal opinion, and it just didn't really do it for me. But I don't ever say to somebody, why did you like that? Because Arrival, I understand and I get that that is a brilliant film for what it is. It just didn't resonate with me. However, talking about Dune Part 2, I think anybody, any kind of movie fan of any nature, whether you're a casual fan, whether you're a die-hard fan, whether you're just someone who wants the escapism of cinema, Dune Part 2 might be the current pinnacle of that, and this generation's pinnacle, because to see things like this put to screen, and I don't just mean visually, because let's talk about the visuals. The visuals of the first Dune are genuinely astounding, but Dune Part 2, the visuals here are mind-blowing. There's scenes in this that had me awestruck, and I don't just mean in massive battle scenes, but certain symbolism, certain way the lighting is, the way the scenes are shot, even just dialogue between two characters. Even just the look of this film is an absolute beauty. It is absolutely fantastic. And I always say that thing about like a desktop wallpaper. Like that's how it feels. Every single frame of this movie could be. That's the feeling of the visuals of Dune Part 2. But talking about that and talking about this kind of escalation of war that comes in Part 2, of course, Dune Part 1 has its war elements and has its kind of beginning of what will come. You know, the calm before the storm, even though there's big battles and big scenes like that in the first film. Dune Part 2 was promised as this expansive nature and expanding on the what was set up in Dune Part 1. And I suppose that's what any sequel hopes to be in any nature, in a comedy, in a horror, in a drama, in a thriller, in a fantasy, in an action film, in anything. You want it to be a build on what was set before. I think of something like Terminator 2. Terminator 2 compared to Terminator 1. Terminator 1 is a decent film. Terminator 2 is one of the greats. And the reason is because James Cameron took what he set up in the first film and completely, in some ways, flipped it on his head, but also built on every aspect. And actually, while Dune Part 1 is such a strong film, Dune Part 2, again, builds on every aspect. Not that it need built on in a lot of ways. Maybe the bigger scale battles, yes, of course. But brilliant things like dialogue, things like character emotions and chemistry and caring and a connectiveness with characters. Because a story like this and a story that is so big in scale. You could so easily get disconnected with all the house names, with all the planets, with, there's so many things. A bit like something like Game of Thrones when it was at its peak, with all the house names. The only reason you cared by that point was because you cared about the characters on screen. And there was that many funny names, like Lannisters, Starks, and things like that. We got to know them as household names because of the brilliance of those early seasons of Game of Thrones. What happened later is a different matter. And that's something here that's clear. It's clearly done in DUNE and in DUNE Part 2. And again, it builds on the lore, it builds on the... there's not a part of this where you go, okay, that's quite a leap. You believe everything going on, even though it is quite fantastical, it is very sci-fi, it is Star Wars in some ways, it is Game of Thrones in some ways, it is all those kind of fantasy elements. But it's also clear that DUNE is probably the inspiration for this, coming from the novelisation and coming from so far back in the 60s. There's so much that I could wax lyrical about here, but there is a few things I kind of want to hone in on and really focus on are so brilliant. And let's start with performances. Because I could simply just go, yeah, everybody's great, they're all fantastic, and yeah, the Oscars will probably be calling for a few of them, and yeah, that's it. But I really want to take the time to talk about some individual performances. And let's start with our main man, Timothée Chalamet. Timothée Chalamet, very recently, I was singing his praises as Wonka, a movie that I didn't think was going to be anywhere as fun and enjoyable as it was, and a lot of that is down to the charisma and joy that Timothée Chalamet brings in that role, to take on the mantle from someone like a Gene Wilder, or that was something that I really thought couldn't have been done as effectively as he did. So it shows that he had that in the locker, and that was more on a connective, fun, charismatic side. But what Timothée Chalamet shows in DUNE Part 2 is serious acting chops, and I mean serious. Like, he is fantastic in this movie because, and I know he's the lead, and this is obviously cliche for so many films, but in this more than many that I can think of, if Timothée Chalamet's performance falls flat, the movie falls flat. Everything centres around Paul Atreides in this, and for him to be as good as this is so rewarding as a fan. Not only of him, but as now the character of Paul Atreides, the story of the Atreides, the story of the Harkonnen, the story of DUNE as a whole. And obviously I'm again going into DUNE Messiah or DUNE Part 3 or whatever it'll be called. I'm going into that blind, and I'm staying that way because I want the same feeling I have from this to learn the story when the movie comes out for the third part. But coming into this, someone like Timothée Chalamet, in what he is able to do as the lead for this, it really can't be understated how fantastic he is. And I don't know that I had... going back a few years to things like The King, things like Call Me By Your Name, and movies that I've seen him in, and I thought he was very good. But I never thought he was to this level, in truth. And I don't know why. Maybe I discredited him in that way, or maybe just thought that he was maybe put in there kind of, maybe his face fit, and Hollywood went, yep, he's our guy now for a lot of things, and that's it. And to be honest, I'm so glad to be proven wrong, because I'm such a big fan of his now, and in the last few times I've seen him, even from DUNE Part 1, Wonka, and now this, in the last wee while, along with other things, he is... I can only imagine what his career... By the time his career comes to a close in Hollywood, God only knows how many faces of franchises he will be, and how fantastic he will be in so many of them. I was so impressed with him. And actually, to kind of lead on that point, kind of in a similar way, is Zendaya. Now, Zendaya is someone that, again, seems to be this face of Hollywood, if you like, now. This young face of Hollywood that is appearing in so many things. And at the start, I'll admit, I kind of thought, why is she getting in everything? Why is she in so many different roles? Is it because she's brilliant, or is it because her face fits, or something like that? And maybe that was shallow of me, but I just hadn't really seen... truthfully, I hadn't seen a performance of hers yet. Then I went, oh my god, she is fantastic. And that didn't come actually until I watched her in Euphoria Season 2. There's a scene in that where she's kind of arguing with her mother and her sister in it, and the nature of it is very hard-hitting subject matter. But that was an episode where I went, oh, I absolutely get it. I absolutely get it. Zendaya is unbelievable as an actress, and can be when she sets her stall out, and when a director and a script allows her to be fantastic, she is absolutely fantastic. Not only just by her emotional side, not even just by her delivery of dialogue, but just by looks. There's some scenes in this where she gives Paul Atreides a look, and that says it all. There isn't a big drawn out narrative that is so pandering to the audience. Just a look tells a story, and Zendaya is one of the best at that in current moment, and especially in this, she, as well as Timothée Chalamet, are the two absolute standouts of this. Like, they are both fantastic. But that's not to discredit anybody else. And I don't want to just keep going, and this next member of the cast, and this next member of the cast, but I want to reel off a few more that I have to give a mention to. And the next one on that is Austin Butler. Austin Butler, I know he was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in a smaller role, but I was really introduced to as Elvis, like probably so many of us. And I thought he was brilliant. I thought he was fantastic as Elvis. And to then see him in this as one of the more evil but also brilliantly connective villains in recent memory, he is amazing in this. And as a villain performance, I'll be thinking about this for a long time. And talking about range, about what Timothy and Zendaya can do, Austin Butler's range, I've only seen him in two things, but Elvis and this role, to be such a contrast in both, and for him to be so brilliant and so emotive in some ways and charismatic in some ways, but also so hollow and so heartless as a villain, he is something special in this. And it's one, as I say, it's a villain performance that I will think about and remember for a long time. And it will certainly be one of the best of the decade. I have no doubt of that, as far as villains go. Another few performances I want to give a special mention to. Rebecca Ferguson, who I thought was absolutely fantastic in the first film, again is fantastic here as Lady Jessica. She is truly, as a mother figure with complex story arc and complex, she is driven by both her duty as a mother, her duty in her role in the story, and her duty as trying to basically ensure everybody is okay, but actually becoming more of a hard hitter with her own son. I was really, the depth of Rebecca Ferguson, and I said this I think when I talked about the first Dune, about her and Dr. Sleep as Rose the Hat, and that was one of my, and talking about villains actually, that ties it back quite well. That's one of my favourite villains in recent memory, Rose the Hat. And she, again, talking about performances where if that doesn't work, the movie doesn't work, Rose the Hat, and Rebecca Ferguson in that role in Dr. Sleep is basically the reason that film is so good, in my opinion. So Rebecca Ferguson, I have no doubt of her credentials, but again, she does surprise me in just how much she brings to these roles. And the other two, and this was kind of this was a little bit of like a fan. I just kind of loved how subtle this was, but seeing Javier Bardem and Josh Brolin on the same side for a small point of this film, and that's, I'm not going to say too much more than that, but having the two of them in side by side in dialogue and different ideologies, but tying that back to something like No Country for Old Men, where they're both like, that was just such a brilliant, that's the first time I've seen the two of them in something since that, and both of them are doing a fantastic job as well, and they can't be understated either, because yes, their role isn't as big, they don't have as much dialogue as our leads, and of course that's going to be the case, but everything they do, they're chewing up the scenery, they're doing so much and giving so much to the plot, giving so much to the story and building so much on the story. But kind of taking away from the performances and talking about the movie as a whole and the story as a whole, this is something that I really couldn't put it into any other words than this. When you think about a movie, and when you think about a movie that really shocks you, and you're kind of in awe of, and you're sitting with your jaw open and going, oh my god, I can't believe what I'm watching on screen. Usually that applies to something like, large battles on scene, or great visuals, or stunning scenery, or that would usually, go hand in hand with that. What I noticed with this, and while there is a lot of that in this movie, certainly, with the battles and, the cinematography and everything, there's no doubt about that, and they're, as I said at the start of this, visually unbelievable. But something I found myself genuinely awestruck by was the storytelling. And especially for this third act. The third act where the story kind of comes, not to a climax, but comes to what the story has been building to in the second part. The last 45 minutes of this movie is genuinely unbelievable. And I don't mean in a way of like, oh my god, I can't believe that's happened. Because if you, and obviously I haven't, but I would imagine if you read the book, you aren't too surprised about the story beats happening. But what you are surprised at is some of the twists and turns, and some of the genuinely unbelievable. Again, the performances are really good. Some of the sullen silences, some of the looks, as I said earlier about Zendaya, she's one of the examples of this. Some of the looks that characters give each other, some of these kind of goosebumps moments that happen throughout this. I was genuinely, because the movie is fantastic. The first and second act, the first one kind of slowly builds into where we had left off in the first film. The second act is where the real meat of the story, the meat of the battles and everything, that's really where that is focused on. But this last act is just wow. It is just special, and that's worth the ticket price alone. There's so much to love in Dune Part 2, and I really feel like I could talk about every minute of the movie. I feel like I could talk about, and this scene is fantastic, and this scene is fantastic, and this person's fantastic, and I could just do that forever. And if you've been talking, or if you've been on Twitter, or if you've heard anybody that's seen this, you're probably hearing they're probably chatting similar to how I am, about how just brilliant it is. I just think if you love storytelling in any way, good storytelling, pure storytelling, charismatic characters, motivations that are clear, and while people are coming at it from different sides, it's clear why everybody's doing what they're doing. There isn't anything that's lost in translation. There isn't anything that is unclear. You aren't lost at any point, even though it's such a big and expansive story. Dune Part 2 is a masterpiece. Dune Part 1 is a borderline a masterpiece, but Dune Part 2 is absolutely a masterpiece. And Denis Villeneuve, as a director, and as current directors, he is right up there with the best working today. What he has under his belt already, before Dune even started, before Dune Part 1 or Part 2, he already was in that bracket, but this just escalates him even more into that top tier. He is a wonderful director, and what he has been able to achieve with this, and if he sticks the landing for Dune Messiah or Dune Part 3 or whatever they decide to call it, if he sticks the landing, we're talking about a real top tier trilogy, and one of the best trilogies we've had in recent memory. Not the best, but right up there. Because Dune as a whole, I am genuinely in love with now. Because the first film I thought was maybe a bit of flash in the pan, and just a real good start, but maybe Part 2 doesn't really keep up with it. Dune Part 2 exceeded all of my expectations. I waited, like we all did, for 3 years for this to come. And it's not often when you go into a movie with such expectation. And I know I said that earlier about I had the expectation, the anticipation, and just cannot wait. I need to see Dune Part 2 as soon as I can. And then it gets pushed back. And then you hear the early reports of people saying 9s, 10s out of 10. The best sequel since The Empire Strikes Back, or The Godfather Part 2, or just one of the greatest sequels of all time. And then you're going, oh my god, how can my expectation be any higher? And then you go into the film, and the film still exceeds your expectations. That's my feeling after Dune Part 2. Dune Part 2 is quite simply the best film I've seen since I started talking about movies in 2021. and it is right up there with the best cinematic experiences I've ever had. Ever. That feeling of when the credits roll and just kind of sitting and having to gather myself, that's a true cinema experience. And Dune Part 2 is absolutely that. Let's get the rating time. Let's not waste our time. Dune Part 2 is a 10 out of 10. Shock. Golden 10 out of 10. The movie is golden. The experience is golden. Everything about Dune Part 2 is an absolute 10 out of 10. 5 out of 5. Whatever you want to call it. It is just perfection. It is as good a sequel as I think I will see for something of this scale in a long time. For what I wanted, Dune Part 2 is better than that. And I don't think there'll be many films this year or in the next few years that will have me feeling like that. I hope there is. If there's other movies that make me feel even anywhere near the way this movie has made me feel, we're on to a real winner. And I heard somebody say about cinema being back. Cinema's been pretty good in the last few years. Cinema's actually been... Yes, we've had a lot of stinkers. Yes, there's been movies that... But that always happens. Every year there's great movies, and every year there's a lot of stinkers. That's just cinema. But what we have had over the last few years, actually from Dune... You know, in 2021 we had things like Dune, we had Spider-Man No Way Home, two movies and very different, but also great in what they were. In 2022 we had The Batman, which I absolutely adored. Everything Everywhere All at Once, which, I mean, the Oscars adored, never mind me. Just fantastic. Last year, I mean, there was a few great movies. Something like Oppenheimer. And I'll tell you this, as a point, because Oppenheimer was my favourite film of last year, and is truly spectacular. And what Christopher Nolan, we're talking about great directors, Christopher Nolan is right in that bracket too. Christopher Nolan's a lucky man. I'll put it that way. Because Oppenheimer and Dune were supposed to come out the same year. And he can thank his lucky stars that Dune Part 2 got pushed back to 2024. When it comes to the Oscar time of next year, and they're talking about who wins what, don't be surprised if Dune Part 2 walks away with a hell of a lot of them. Or certainly some of the big ones. And I think they'd get my vote too. Dune Part 2 is simply fantastic. You've probably heard, like me, everybody else saying about just how brilliant it is. For my 10 cents, if you're wanting to go and see it, if you're somehow sitting on the fence about going to see it, if you haven't seen the first one, do the work. It may feel like, well, it shouldn't, but if it feels like work to sit and watch the first film on streaming, try and watch it on as big of a television, or if you can see it on a rescreening in the cinema, please definitely do that. But watching Dune Part 2, if you're in any if you're in any kind of movie fan, if you're in any way a fan of movie and storytelling on a large scale like this, Dune Part 2 is a film that you have to see. Not should, have to. And yeah, that's my review for just a truly brilliant film. I'm a happy boy. I came into this year, and this was one that I really hoped would be as brilliant as I hoped it would be. And for it to have exceeded that, I'm just so happy. And yeah, that has been my thoughts for Dune Part 2. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, let me know. You hit subscribe, stick around on the channel, I appreciate you so much for it. And if you do, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love everyone.